Hi everyone, if I can get your attention please. If you can have a seat, we're going to start the talk of the evening. Is your whoops. You don't want to lose those. So tonight we're going to have Mike talk to us about using open source software in your organization. Mike, take it away.
Yep, thanks. Can everyone hear me okay at the back? Rachel's at the back. This is the third. I was thinking before I did this, like, right, I don't think there's going to be anyone here who's heard this talk before, because I have a nasty habit of just recycling talks again and again. But this is the third time Rachel has heard this, so it's, yeah. So if I get, yeah, it's fine. But, you know, if I fall ill halfway through, then get Rachel to just finish it off. So thanks for having me tonight. It's nice to see kind of lots of new people at TechMeetUp. I used to be involved kind of a few years ago, but then things like a baby happened and I don't get out as much as I once did. I come at like the topic of open source with two different hats on. My sort of part-time fun evenings and weekends thing is I work on Homebrew. Has anyone heard of or use Homebrew? Cool. For those of you who don't, it's like a package manager for your Mac. Basically, think of like an app store for your terminal for like the command line applications. And that's kind of what we try and do. So I've been working on that for 10 years this year. I'm the kind of project lead at the moment. I have another baby coming at some point, so I'm trying to do what I can to like reduce the dependence on me as an individual having to fix things. But yeah, we'll get there eventually. And then my thing that actually pays the bills and my day job is I work at an engineer at GitHub, working on kind of open sourcey stuff as well. I work from home for them here in Edinburgh. I've worked there 5 and a bit years now. Anyone here use GitHub? Cool, most folks. And yeah, I've been a big fan of GitHub since before I worked there. I use it a lot for Homebrew and various other projects that I kind of work on. I'm going to ask for lots of like hand raising as we go through because it's fun and it will stop you from falling asleep and help me like learn that hopefully you're all listening to something I say. But also because we've got a little bit longer to do this talk because I think I'm the only speaker, if any of you have any pressing questions that you would like to kind of raise that you feel would be beneficial to the room, or particularly if you're someone who is relatively new to tech or new to TechMeetUp or new to this topic, and I say something and I don't clarify and you don't understand, chances are there's going to be at least 5 or 10 other people who also think the same and aren't sure what's going on. So please feel free to stick up your hand and everyone will be thankful because there is no such thing as stupid questions. Right, so I'm going to talk through, I guess, 3 sort of stages in this talk today, which is firstly, why open source software at all? Like, why do people use it? What are some of the reasons people talk about using it? And what are, in my opinion at least, the good reasons and bad reasons for using open source software in your organization. I'm going to try and come across this from the angle of you are a company or university or whatever, and you're building software in some form, and you're wanting to use open source software in your organization to make yourself build software in a better way, and you want to do that effectively. So hopefully that ends up fitting most of you in the room, or at least most of where you would all like to end up in the room. And then also, I guess the next step is to talk about how to have a really crappy experience using open source software, because it's often, you know, the best way I find to learn is by talking through like all the horrible negative failure first, and then we can then pivot from that into how to win and how to have a good experience building open source. So let's start off with seeing some of the good reasons and bad reasons I think some organizations are using open source. So The first thing is proprietary software costs money and open source software is free. So by proprietary software here, I mean software that is not open source effectively. They're effectively just mutually exclusive definitions where, so say an app that you download on your phone, if I can't get access to the source code, if I don't have the rights to modify that application and redistribute it and ship my own version that's slightly modified, we would call that proprietary software. Whereas open source is stuff where I have all the rights I just talked about, and I can go and get the source code, modify it how I like, and do whatever. So the most common thing with open source, and why you might hear people saying this, is because normally that almost always means that open source software is free to use. It doesn't cost you any money. So if I'm picking between two software projects and one of them costs me, whatever it may be, $1,000 per developer per year or whatever, whereas the other one doesn't cost me any money, then wow, that's great. I can save lots of money and whatever. So I don't need to buy the software anymore, and I don't need to pay anyone to support the software for me, and I don't need to pay for any training or whatever on the software. And those are all things for the proprietary software that I'm going to have to pay to do. So everything costs money. You knew that already. With open source software, yes, it's correct that actually purchasing the software doesn't cost you anything because you don't have to purchase it and have a licensing agreement with a vendor. But chances are, if you're trying to learn something completely new off the top of your head, and if you're trying to work with something internally and maybe work with something at scale that hasn't been done before or hasn't been done in your organization before, at the very least, then you are probably going to find someone who you want to pay to help train you or help support things. Or if you're not paying with your money, then you're going to pay with your time because it might take longer to get up and running. So that's not to say that this is a reason not to use open source software, but it is to say that it's not a good reason by itself, that it just costs less. So a saying that used to go around, I don't hear people saying it as much nowadays, which was that desktop Linux is only free if your time is worth nothing. So that's the same thing that I'm getting at here. Again, this is not a slight on desktop Linux or people who use it, but it is saying when I was at university, for example, I had very little money and lots of free time. And then nowadays, I have very little time and more money. And the technologies you may end up using, similarly if you're a cash-strapped startup versus if you're an enterprise organization who can ask your finance team to pay for software that you need to get your job done, it often makes sense to optimize for your developer time and not optimize for spending as much time as possible just because something is free. So, in my opinion, this is a fairly bad reason by itself to use open source software. The next reason you might hear people say is that the community will help you fix all your problems for you. And then, again, for free, because with a proprietary software product, you might go and buy it, and then you would say, hey, I found this problem. And then they will say to you, oh, well, okay, well, maybe in some future release we might sort this out. Or if it's a really big proprietary software company and it's a, say a smaller organization that's using that software, they may well say, well, take it or leave it. You can pay us, you can not pay us. We don't have any plans to add this feature or fix this in future. Whereas with open source, I can go and just open a random issue on the internet and I can tell a stranger why it's very important that they fix my problem right now because I have a deadline on Friday and they need to make sure that all this stuff gets sorted because I'm using their software and they should be very glad about that. As you can perhaps tell from the laughter and or my tone, that's maybe not the best way of thinking about open source software. So you definitely can't read that. But the most important bit of this is the Ruby on Rails contribution guide. I'm going to read out in full. Then, don't get your hopes up unless you have a code red, mission critical, the world is coming to an end kind of bug. You're creating this issue report in the hope that others with the same problem will be able to collaborate with you on solving it. Do not expect that the issue report will automatically see any activity or that others will jump to fix it. Creating an issue like this is mostly to help yourself start on the path of fixing the problem and for others to confirm it with a I'm having this problem too comment. So in short, on Ruby on Rails, they're really setting the expectation that if you have a bug, like, don't expect that it's going to get fixed by anyone except you, or anyone except a group of people who you could find on the Ruby on the Rails bug tracker to collaborate with on fixing this bug. I actually think this is a really good thing. I'll come back to this later on. This sort of hints towards a reason why open source is good for software development, in my opinion, and good to use for your tooling. But the original reason about the community is going to just fix all your problems for you, that gets, it's not quite untrue, but it certainly gets a raised eyebrow. And obviously as well, if you're an organization where you have lots and lots of resources, and you're relying on volunteers in their evenings and weekends, spending their time to fix your problems so you can continue to make more money, which you're not interested in giving back to that community, then you are not great. There's various other words that I would use, but it's a family-friendly environment. Another reason you may have heard people say is just, well, open source is kind of cool now. Everyone's using it for everything. Like, you see it all over the place. Everyone has GitHub repos, what they're sharing when they have libraries they're using or whatever it may be. If you npm install stuff, then that's all going to come off open source packages and things like that. So I guess let's explore this a little bit deeper. So I guess that, again, I'm going to very broadly generalize here, but the evolution of people who use open source, you had a lot of people who started using it in the outset, and then it's grown more and more to kind of become a more and more popular way of doing software development and more popular to use. So let's kind of walk through these kind of groups, in my opinion, of how they've sort of started. So as much as I made the little joke at their expense earlier, the people who run Linux on their desktops and stuff like that, people who are really into open source software, or free software, as people sometimes refer to it as, those are the type of people who really kind of got it all started. They got open source and free software kind of started off the ground, and they're the people who still are a big part of the community that kind of builds the things that everything else builds on top of. Then you have the Linux on the server people. Again, this has been, as much as Linux on the desktop aren't widely used, perhaps as much, Linux on the server, if you're deploying some new application or writing some new application, has been kind of the default for a lot of organizations, particularly smaller startups, say, for, I would say, 10 plus years at this point. Obviously, if you're on a Microsoft stack, then you may well not do that. But then, in general, I'm talking, this is an area which has seen a lot of growth. Then you start seeing, as I mentioned, startups are starting to use open source more and more kind of by default. Again, partly perhaps because they're free, but partly as well because it allows you to build on top of stuff from other people without having to invest as much time into both commercial relationships and the money side. Bigger companies get more and more into open source. Your kind of IBMs, everyone like that, again, are 5 or 10 years down the line from using open source for almost everything. And then Microsoft, who, again, some of those who have been in the open source space for a while will remember, used to do things like call open source cancer and say how terrible it all is and that it's a virus that's going to infect people and communism, and like these are all actual words that used to get used. Now Microsoft are one of the biggest contributors to the Linux kernel. They're one of the biggest open source contributors on GitHub, and they bought GitHub last year as well. They are, and to clarify, I'm not a Microsoft employee. That we are still technically a separate company. So this isn't me trying to suck up to anyone, but it's a sign for me of how far things have come and how much things have changed from, coming up to 15 years ago when I was at university, when Microsoft were the main people who were trying to stop open source, who have gone completely 180 now and seem to be one of the big people who are trying to promote it. And then now pretty much everyone is using open source. You're seeing all the companies who kind of used to be traditionally hostile to open source, not just Microsoft, but other places as well, are kind of starting to open up, are starting to at least use it more, if not releasing more of it themselves. So again, you can kind of see as you step through this as well, you probably get a sense of like what types of open source is being used for things as well. So I guess I mentioned people using open source and Linux on all their servers. So I guess that was the main starting point to kind of thin into the wedge for a lot of things where people were using, you could spin up a Linux server with Apache, which was a kind of web server on it, and use that very, very cheaply, even kind of 20 years ago, to kind of run services on the internet to a commercial standard, but without having to buy any software. And you could do that on any average PC you would just buy in a shop. Then after that, you start seeing more and more like server applications which are being used in that way. WordPress, again, was one of the big ones that, again, people found you could download this thing, you could install it on, again, your very average or cheap Linux server that you've set up yourself, and then all of a sudden you now have a really pretty easy to use website which is editable by non-technical people. Then more and more, again, the chronology here isn't so much when these tools were created, but how they've grown in use. You start to see things like SQLite, which is a single file database, which is a cool little C library, incredibly robust, that is used all over the place. Loads and loads of mobile apps use this, basically loads and loads of applications that you would have no idea even have a need for a database. A lot of them end up using SQLite underneath the hood. Developer tools like Git, again, obviously the growth of GitHub means that more and more people are using things like this. There were various other proprietary kind of version control systems. There still are a few that exist, but nowadays, again, everyone is kind of moving towards like expecting all their development tools are going to be cross-platform and are going to be open source. And then you're starting to see Microsoft doing things like open sourcing .NET, which again is not mentioned because it's so great, but mentioned because it's, again, so kind of hard to get your head around if you've been kind of following this space for a while, that this was the company's almost like golden goose of the company who was the most anti-open source company in some cases in the world, who are now open sourcing the most arguably core and competitive parts of some of their products, and are building a new text editor, which I kind of happen to like and use, which is, again, completely open source and arguably stealing kind of mind share and product share away from other things which you could be using to pay the money. So the statement everyone else uses open source software now, I would say that statement is both correct, and I actually think it's also a good reason to use open source software in general. I think when you get to a point where the industry you work in is generally all moving in a particular direction, yeah, sure, they could be wrong, but chances are like that's probably something that you need to learn about and get involved in. But thankfully, you're all here at this talk, so you're going to be experts by the end of the evening. Right, so now we've talked a little bit about some of the history of this stuff and what I think are kind of good reasons to use it. Let's talk about how to really have a horrible experience when you're using open source software to insist that you can just have a bad time. So the first thing is this statement, let's just fork this and edit this for now. Who's familiar with what I mean by forking in the context of open source? Cool, so some people, not everyone. So forking is a thing on, I guess GitHub will be the primary place people might refer to it as that, or GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever it may be. It's basically when you take someone else's code for an open source project, and then you make your own version, and then maybe slightly modify it so it meets your needs. Now, what I'm using in this example is it might be confusing that I'm saying this is a bad thing, because was I not saying one of the great things about open source is that you can modify software? Well, so the thing about this is that what ends up happening is you plan on maybe just making a fork and making some changes, but then you say to yourself, okay, well, we'll just do this little hack for now, and then later on we'll kind of figure out what the problem is or adjust our configuration or whatever it may be. But in reality, you end up having this modified version which you just sit on using forever. So if it might be an NPM module, it might be a web server, it might be a WordPress plugin, whatever it may be. If you've made your own little in-house modifications of you for this open source software, it will be very hard for you to then keep up to date, because what happens is when the new versions are released, you're going to have to apply your changes on top of that every single time for every new release, and that's going to be a pain, so you probably aren't going to do that. So what ends up happening with that is you can justify to yourself that, oh, well, you know, as tends to happen sometimes with software now, that, well, we don't want to update to new versions anyway because there might be some bugs in the new versions if we update, so better safe than sorry, we'll just stay on the same version of everything and only update when we have a problem. But the problem with that is that a lot of updates you're going to get in a lot of software are related to security issues as well. When they find a security issue, they are going to release a patch which fixes that security issue for you. And the problem is, usually as well, at the same time as the security issue being released and the patch being released, or before, or certainly after, you're going to have a situation where now the internet knows how to hack that particular version of that particular software. So if you have something like WordPress I mentioned earlier, if you are running an old version of WordPress on your server because you decided to fork and slightly modify it, and then WordPress released an update saying, oh, we found this bad hack that if you do blah, 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 then you can get access without using a password to the admin panel or whatever it may be. The problem is now the internet knows how to do that, and if they can detect that you are on an old version of WordPress, then it's trouble for you. So it's not just the security updates might cause bugs, but you need to ask yourself, if you get hacked, is that going to cause bugs? Is that going to cause any issues for your customers? Are they going to be very happy with you if you get hacked and they steal all of your customers' private information? They are probably not going to be very happy with you, and you may well be in big trouble. Thankfully, we're in a situation right now, well, perhaps thankfully, perhaps not, where as an engineer, you are not generally held personally, legally accountable for the loss of information in your firm. But I think it's something that we should consider as an industry, whether you've been in it for a while or whether you're kind of just starting out, that, think of yourself like an engineer on a bridge or something similar like that. That if you are legally not liable for if that bridge falls down and causes negative impacts on other people, then one would hope that you would try and do the right thing and make sure that you build bridges that do not fall down, even if you are not legally liable for that, because it is the right thing to do. And I would argue that similarly with security stuff and with keeping up to date on things, it is the right thing to do. And you may need to sometimes get in grumpy fights with your bosses and management who do not want to hear the justification of why you need to delay the sprint or whatever it may be in order to apply a security update. But it is the right thing to do, and therefore we should argue with people and do it anyway. Or if you can't accurately convince them, then sometimes the right thing to do is to silently do it and not tell them that you're doing it, because it is the right thing to do. So a question with this as well that is worth asking yourself. So how many people work for an organization or have any open source projects who use any libraries that they are aware of that are open source? Quite a lot. How many of you have any way of telling, if I gave you 10 minutes and I said, I want you to tell me which of your libraries have vulnerabilities in them, how many of you would be able to tell me the answer to that question? Not zero, which is good. So to be fair, a lot of people in a lot of very big organizations find this stuff hard, and it is hard, and I've definitely been at GitHub at times where I could not have answered this question for the projects I've been working on. So this is not a public shaming thing or anything like that, do not worry. But this is a thing which is worth you thinking about, particularly if you are sitting on old versions or if you are running forked versions of things. This is the reason why generally staying on the newer versions is a good idea. But also, this is a reason why it's worth checking out like tooling that does stuff like this. I'm in no way affiliated with them other than the fact that I think it's really, really great software. But if you are doing this for projects on GitHub, there's a great little tool called Dependabot, which basically will go and check all your, say, gem files or npm module files, and I forget what the Python equivalent one is called, and will basically submit pull requests for updates to those libraries if it detects outdated versions, and it will go and put a little thing with the release notes and stuff like that. So that's a really, really awesome tool. It's free for open source. You pay for closed source projects, but it's well worth it, I would say. As I say, I have no affiliation with them other than I think it is really, really good, and it's saved me a bunch of time. So another thing that may cause you issues that I alluded to earlier with open source software is if you end up in a situation where you're like, there's this bug or this missing feature or whatever it is with this open source project I'm using, and I have this deadline on Friday, and I just need to tell them how important this is, this issue, that it gets fixed. So hopefully they'll understand and they'll fix the issue. That often doesn't work very well, particularly, and this is not something, again, you would be surprised perhaps to hear that this is not something that is kind of a very junior engineer or a very kind of only bad companies or badly educated people make this sort of mistake. But you get people from Google and Facebook who will still post on your open source project about how important it is that you drop everything you're doing and work on this right now. And I guess I'll let you read that for yourself. But in my opinion, with open source, you aren't really entitled to very much from the developers who make it at all. I wrote a blog post about this with a slightly flame-baby title. But if you read any open source license, it basically says that. Like, it actually literally says if the open source software you're using causes any damage to you, then you have disclaimed all, effectively, if the open source software burns down your house, in using it, you have said, that's fine. Like, that's my responsibility. It's on me, it's not on you who made the open source software. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Again, not because it is likely to burn down your house, at least not the software I write, at least not intentionally. But it's worth considering, again, that it is a thing which those people who create it do not have any obligation to you, and they do not respond well to the sense that they do have an obligation to you. If anything, it's the other way around. So I'll come back to this a little bit later on. But then another reason, and this is a slightly tangential one, that you hear some organizations saying now, oh, sorry, we have a question. Yeah, or a clarification. Yeah, well, that's a really good point. For anyone who couldn't hear, it was making the comment that if you have a similar relationship with Microsoft and you're paying them lots of money, then equally they're not going to turn around and fix your bug for you straight away either. So that's not a thing you can expect with closed source software either. And also it's worth noting, again, similarly, which I thought you were maybe going to say, but the license agreements you end up signing for most open source software, and I mean really anything in your life, you know, if you go paintballing, then you tend to sign a disclaimer saying, if someone accidentally puts a bullet in here and I die, then it's not my fault, and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, a lot of these legal disclaimers have dubious legal basis, but yet most organizations will ask you to sign them anyway. And I see open source as being a similar thing, except in some cases with open source, at least, these licenses have been tested in court and found that, like, well, you actually did agree to this, so you can't claim damages on these people, which is good. So, slight tangent, thanks for the question. A thing you see more and more organizations doing now is wanting to open source their own stuff. They have sometimes some interesting motivations for this. So no one tends to be quite as blunt as this, but sometimes that's the motivation. It's like, well, we've got this little library internally that we use, and no one really, you know, has much time to work on it internally. But if we open source, then maybe some more people come along and just say, hey, yeah, I'll just work on your library that you use at your company that's kind of irrelevant to the world at large, and I'll just work in my free time and evenings and weekends to make it better free. And yeah, sometimes that does happen if you are Facebook or whoever. But in reality, this is a more realistic expectation. So if you have to have made something that's you're going to open source, if you want people to get involved, it needs to be already pretty good and pretty useful. It needs to be something where people who aren't at your organization find interesting and find exciting and find will solve their problems for them. And like the thing I mentioned earlier with Ruby on Rails and fixing issues there, it's the same kind of deal, really, where you may well find this is a good place for people to come together to collaborate on similar problems. But chances are if they're going to do that, they may well not want to solve the exact problems that you want them to solve. And a big thing which we found with Homebrew, for example, this is a little thing I came up with called the contributor funnel, which is kind of a horrible hacked version of a sales funnel, but with open source instead, because I don't know. But effectively, the way you want to think about any sort of project, any sort of open source project, I guess like any sort of thing where you're trying to get people into some sort of system, into some sort of sales funnel or whatever it may be, is that as you go through the flow, you're going to have fewer and fewer people getting involved. So the more users that you have of your software project, you may well get some of those users who are interested in contributing some fixes or some documentation changes or whatever it may be. And then some subset of the people who are interested in doing that may well be interested in coming and being maintainers and helping review the work that contributors do and submit to your project, for example. But in Homebrew's case, for example, the drop-off on these numbers is fairly ridiculous. So we have, from our analytics, like over 1 million users, I reckon. It's kind of hard to tell exactly, but I reckon that's about right. We have 7,000 plus contributors, which for an open source project is pretty respectable. Like, you know, you get some that are beating us now on these types of numbers, but again, I guess 5 years ago on GitHub, we were kind of regularly kind of one of the most contributed to projects. But then we have like tens of maintainers, basically. We've never had more than, I think, we've definitely never had as many as 30 on board at once, and we've had as few as kind of 2 or 3 on board at once. And again, of those maintainers, the people who you can rely on to respond within a 24-hour period, say, like 5 days, say during the working week, you're probably down to kind of 5 or 6 people. So you basically have a very small number of people who are managing the work of a larger but still relatively small number of people who are supporting lots and lots and lots of people. And that's cool because software allows you to kind of scale like this. But I mention this for if you have some open source project, whether it's an organization or whether it's your personal one that you've made perhaps, and you have 100 users, and you're asking why you don't have 20 maintainers, then perhaps think about the potential drop-off you're going to have there, and also potentially think about, like, you're going to have to get a lot of people wanting to contribute before you're going to have people who are going to want to stick around and help marshal those contributions from other people. I've done a talk about this and a blog post about like the contribution funnel. If you're interested in this kind of topic, then there's more detail on that in that. So how to do things right instead. So the first thing I would say, I guess, going back to all the stuff I've been saying about forks, is everything should be upstream. Now, what do I mean by upstream here? So the upstream project is the project, if you make a fork, is the original project that you forked from. So say on GitHub, for example, there might be a project called homebrew/brew. My fork of that might be called Mike McQuaid/brew. So the upstream is homebrew/brew, and the fork is Mike McQuaid/brew. So what do I mean by everything should be upstream? Well, I mean when you modify the code in your own fork, the goal should be to always try and get that code in some form back into the original project. And the reason for this is because you don't want stuff to be your problem. Like I was speaking to someone the other day, and about, what was it? They were asking what they think the most valuable attributes are in engineers. And for me, it's being fearful and being lazy. So being fearful of all the problems that happen with computers, and therefore wanting to be involved with these type of problems as little as you possibly can to solve the problem. And also being lazy in that you want to write as little code as possible, and you don't want to have to maintain as much code as you can. So you want to try, and if you can get other people to maintain your code for you, then that's way better than doing it all yourself. So how can you do this? Well, I'll kind of walk you through the step-by-step approach. So we talked earlier about when you fork the other project, you're going to fork it, you're going to make your changes and things like that. There's going to be some degree after that of testing. If nothing else, if you're making changes that say are just to be rolled out on your servers or on your computers or whatever it may be, then you're going to have some degree of local testing to make sure that that actually works the way it's meant to work. It might be just you manually running commands or clicking around or whatever. But then it's always nice, if you can, to write some sort of little manual automated test that you can get there, particularly if the original source project has a nice collection of tests, then perhaps you can add a test in there to verify the thing that you're trying to do. Well, next after that, if you've actually written it in a clean fashion and you've written a nice little test for it, then you're probably in a pretty good situation to submit a pull request back. To be clear, there are some projects that don't require tests for all the changes, including like most of the ones that I work on. So if you can't write an automated test or you haven't, then don't feel that that means that you can't submit it back. And then you'll probably get on your pull request when you submit it some comments from the people who are running the project. It may be that they have a particular coding style. It may be that your test works on your particular server's configuration but might break on another configuration, and they need you to make some changes. So you address those changes, and then your project will eventually get merged, which means that your pull request will get merged, which means that the changes that you made in your fork get included into the main project. And then that means in future, when you can update to the latest versions, you can delete your fork, and then all the changes that you made will be in the main project. And this, in effectively one slide, is why open source is great and why it works so well. Because ultimately, you can help others to help you by helping yourself. When you solve a problem, it doesn't mean that thousands of people also need to independently solve that problem in their own way. If you can submit it back to the project, you can have one person who can solve the problem, and then everyone else can benefit from that solution. The other thing that's worth mentioning with this is you might be a little bit intimidated by this and think, well, I don't know if I can do all this stuff by myself. Well, if you can't, you find a lot of projects, if you're willing to even try and go some of the way there, people will want to help you. The opposite with open source I've mentioned before about how irritating it is when you have someone, particularly someone from an organization like Google or Facebook who should really know better, who is making demands on your time and insistent that you fix the problem. The opposite end of the spectrum, and the thing that really, really sucks pretty much anyone who's excited about open source and maintaining open source into helping people is when you have the opposite end, where you have someone who maybe isn't super experienced, but they really want to just try and do the right thing. And they want you to help them like figure out what the right thing is to do and how to do it. If you do that, then on the vast majority of open source projects, you will be met with a good response and you will be met with people who want to help you learn. So how can we do this stuff? How can you help yourself as well? That's another thing worth asking here. So the reason why I mentioned that as well is because with open source projects, particularly the slide we saw before where you have like 10 or so people who are effectively supporting indirectly or directly millions of people who use the software, it doesn't scale for those 10 people to answer very basic questions again and again and again. So what they want you to do is they want, when you're coming to ask them questions, to feel like that is the end of a road of your own personal investigation rather than the beginning of the road. So you can help yourself firstly by reading the documentation for the project. The project may not have very much, but if it has some, then before you submit an issue or before you ask other people to help you, then try and read through that stuff first. You want to, when you do submit an issue, you want them to be minimally reproducible. And by that, what I mean is it should take the person who runs the project as little time as possible for them to be able to see your issue. So for example, with a tool like Homebrew, you run it through the terminal and you run various commands, like you might type brew install wget or whatever it may be. So if someone can give me a single command that I can type that on my machine will also break as it has done on their machine, then that means that it's very quick for me to be able to then jump in and start fixing the problem. If they write paragraphs and paragraphs of text about how, you know, they tried running some stuff last week and it worked a bit weird, and then now, you know, if they don't effectively get to the point and tell me what I need to do to find the problem myself, then it makes me very hard for me to actually help them. In general, this is not a bad practice to have inside your company as well. If you're asking another team to help you or a coworker to help you or whatever, if you can whittle problems down to their smallest like individual thing to try and demonstrate what a problem is, then that is the easiest way to get someone else to help. So the next thing you can do is when you have whittled it down to the smallest minimal thing, then if you have any experience with that code or if you have enough experience with the application to kind of have a mental model of how it works, then you could maybe look at the code and see if you can figure out like, well, what part of the code or what file do I think maybe this problem is starting to happen in? And you can maybe have a little look around in there. And if it might happen that it appears obvious to you what the problem is that, you know, maybe there's some assumption that's been made there, or maybe your machine is a little bit different and this code doesn't seem to account for your machine being different or whatever it may be. And then you can maybe try and fork it and modify it yourself. And then perhaps if you manage to fix your own problem, you can submit a fix as a pull request. And I just tricked you from reading the documentation now to going and submitting a pull request and fixing your own problem. And to be clear, again, I'm not saying everyone should be able to do all these steps or everyone will do these steps every time. But again, you may find if there are projects you use a lot every day and if you're familiar with them and if you have the time to step through this, because to be clear, I'm not saying that this is always something you're going to have time to do every single step of, you may well find that you're able to solve your own problems in a more effective way. And again, to step back with what we were saying with open source, this is the wonderful thing about open source, because with proprietary software or software you're paying other people for, or the apps you have on your phone, this stops here. The best you can do is submit a really, really good bug report and hope that that is so well written and so easy to fix that they will fix it for you in a timely fashion. But as we all know, that doesn't always happen, so you're stuck. Whereas the beauty of open source is you are in control of the own stuff you're doing. And you, as an organization, can, in theory at least, when you're afflicted with horrible bugs that are affecting you as an organization much worse than other people, you have it in your power to fix those things for yourself. So we talked earlier as well about how you get negative reactions perhaps from open source maintainers if you come along and behave in an entitled fashion, for example. But how can you get a nice reaction from them instead? So firstly, you want to have reasonable expectations of what you're going to get back from people. So for example, don't expect that if it's a problem that affects just your machine and none of your coworkers' machines, for example, but you will have the same machines set up or whatever. That's probably not something that they're going to be able to find a lot of time and energy to fix if it's not something that even your kind of peers can find as well. You need to prioritize their time. As I mentioned before, a lot of open source is done on people's evenings, weekends, lunch breaks, unauthorized time at work. Some people have full-time jobs where they are spending all their time working on open source, and that's great. And there's a lot of open source projects now where people are working on it as their full-time main job, but that's not the case everywhere. So you need to make sure you prioritize the time of the people who are maintaining that software. As I said before, ways of doing that include making sure you read the docs and done a bit of research before you ask other people. Similarly, kind of defer to them. I'm not saying every maintainer on every open source project is a lovely person or knows everything or whatever it may be, but ultimately, if they're the person who is up to them whether your pull request gets merged or not, there's not really a lot of point in arguing with them about code style or whatever. You should just do what they say and move on with your life and make your own project where you use single quotes for strings instead of double quotes or whatever it may be. And then finally, help others where you can. Again, every single person in this room, whether you're technical, non-technical, an engineer, in product, in design, whatever it may be, you will know some stuff about some software that other people do not know. And again, in open source, the way to get open source people to like you and the way for open source to all work well is when you know something that someone else doesn't, try to help them. If you are opening an issue, for example, and asking for help, a really nice thing you can do is perhaps then click to the issues list after you've submitted your issue and see if there's anything there that jumps out to you that you might be able to offer your help with. And your help can even be, in some cases, saying, hey, I'm also having the same problem, and I am on Linux instead of Mac, or whatever it may be. And that's the type of thing which everyone has the power to do. It takes a little bit of time, but again, if you can spend that little bit of time, you'll have a good reaction, and you will also have the nice fuzzy feeling of knowing that you've helped other people. If you want to know more about kind of getting involved with open source, maintaining open source software, and contributing and stuff like that, there's the open source guides. These were built by some coworkers at GitHub. I was a little bit involved with that as well. It's HTTPS opensource.guide. They're not GitHub centric, and we worked with loads and loads of kind of seasoned open source maintainers to kind of build these, and I still think that they're, although I am slightly biased, they're the best resource on the internet for kind of learning how to get started with open source. So, in brief summary, so why use open source? Don't use it because it doesn't cost money, or because other people will help you for free, but use it because everyone else does now. You can fail at open source by forking things and sticking on old versions of libraries which get hacked, by being whiny and entitled towards open source maintainers, and demanding that they fix your problem right now and for free. And you can win by upstreaming all your changes from your forks into the main project so you can be lazy and not have to maintain it anymore, by trying to help yourself before you ask other people to help them, and by trying to be a nice person in life in general. So if you have any coworkers or anyone who might be interested in this talk as well, I have written this up as a bit of a blog post too. It's tinyurl.com/notfailopensourcesoftware. Also, if you have any questions, we'll do Q&A in a sec. If you have any questions you don't want to say now, or you don't catch me or whatever it may be, feel free to email me. I do actually read all of my emails and reply to almost all of them. I used to reply to literally all of them, and then a coworker reminded me that sometimes it's nicer to not reply than to reply, not saying a nice thing. And then finally, I'm on Twitter, and I talk pretty much exclusively about open source there as well. So thank you very much for having me, and we'll do some Q&A in a sec.
Right. If anyone has any questions.
I was gonna ask, it seems like everything's trending to be open source, businesses using open source. Do you think that's gonna be a thing in the future, that they exclusively pretty much use open source? I mean, why pay for anything?
Well,
if everyone else is not paying for something.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So to repeat in case anyone didn't hear, the question was, while businesses look like they're kind of all trending towards using open source, will it just kind of become the thing and sort of take over everything? I think the answer is almost yes. So one of the previous founders of GitHub wrote a blog post about this a while ago that I thought summed up well, which is the title was Open Source Almost Everything. So the argument basically he was making is if you're an organization who say, I guess like GitHub, right, where you're a Git hosting platform and there are other Git hosting platforms out there, and there is stuff that you do better than your competitors, if you open source that, then your competitors immediately get to take your code and become effectively just as good. But there are parts of your code that, like, realistically, people do not use GitHub because, for example, our Markdown editor is better than the competitors. So the argument might be, well, open source the stuff that doesn't really matter, basically the stuff that kind of your business is built upon, and then the really competitive kind of special source that you have that no one else has, that's the stuff you can not open source. Now, there will be some people who would say you need to open source everything, like ethically or whatever it may be, or that that's the best thing to do. And in some ways, I don't even disagree with them that it's maybe the nice and best thing for humanity to do. The problem is we don't have a good solution right now, at least, for being paid full-time to just release all your stuff as open source. If you make a startup, and the interesting thing in the last year or so is you have had a few big startups like Elastic and MongoDB and places like that, where that was more or less their business model, is that we will make everything we do open source, and then we will get people to pay us for other stuff. The problem has been that that strategy has not really worked out for them, because companies like Amazon, for example, and I'm not making a value judgment on this at all, can go and say, well, we're going to use your software and we're going to distribute it at scale, and everyone can pay us the money instead of paying you any money. So then we get to take effectively the open source software you built and sell it to other people for money. And technically, Amazon hasn't done anything legally wrong with any of that, and similarly, the other company hasn't done anything legally wrong, but it ends up in a situation where it doesn't look like it's commercially viable to sell exclusively open source software, from my perspective at least. So that's my long answer, maybe.
Potentially sort of controversial question, but just try to stimulate debate. What do you suggest you do about opinionated open source maintainers? So, like for example, found an issue in Create React app recently. Went to dig through the source and find out what the problem was. Discovered that it had been added deliberately by a maintainer in a pull request with a comment that explained why he did it. So how does that kind of fit in with the sort of contribute upstream? I'm not talking about anything exotic here, like what I was trying to achieve. It was just, you know, the goals of what I was trying to do weren't quite aligned with the project.
No, that's a good question. And I think that is a situation in which maybe you do need to consider just forking the project. It's a tricky thing because ultimately if they are doing more stuff that you want, but you maybe don't agree with the ethos underneath it, then my attitude in general is, with software projects I use at least, my attitude is I either suck it up and I basically just accept what the project does, and if there's decisions they do that I don't like, then rather than modifying the code, I might maybe write a wrapper around it, like that goes and modifies the responses from particular methods or whatever, so I can change the behavior, so I don't need to rely on having forked it. Or I try and find an alternative, or the one that I don't personally do very often, but I know is advocated in the situations, is just write your own alternative inside your application of the subset of the functionality you actually need. But I think the tough thing is, I think in general, if the open source maintainer has decided something, even if in some cases, and I've personally done this, in some cases they've done it because they almost just don't like the way people are doing stuff and they want to force things to be done in a particular way because they feel opinionated about that, you kind of just need to suck it up, basically. It's kind of hard to say that, but that's almost like the definition of the open source license stuff means that you're kind of just, in some ways open source is charity, but not in the way that people necessarily think, in that it's charity from the maintainer to the community, and you kind of, in the same way that if someone decides to kind of charitably give £100 to you and you say, I'd actually rather have, I'd rather have 50 quid and some ice cream. Like that generally doesn't go down well to have a kind of negotiation in those sorts of interactions.
I don't know if you were referring obliquely there to choning your user directory, but let's not go into that.
Oh, no. That was a homebrew reference to a particular design decision. But no, I wasn't referring to that.
I haven't been completely up to date with the scene, but what was the tipping point for Microsoft to shift so heavily towards open source, and how do we convince other big companies and medium-sized companies to do the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to be clear, I'm a senior engineer, which means that I don't have anyone underneath me, and I have no experience of running any sort of company of any sort of size, let alone one of the biggest companies in the world. So this is my very much amateur attempt at inferring of why they've done what they've done and believing the CEO of Microsoft about what he's said from what I've read. So sufficiently caveated, I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's say it anyway. So my take is that Microsoft realized that they used to be kind of a box software company where they would sell software to either computer manufacturing companies, they would sell them Windows in bulk, or they would sell stuff like Office to enterprises, to consumers, whatever, and that's how they made their money. And then as time has gone on, they've realized that services is the way forward, i.e., if you can, stuff like Office 365, if you can convince people to pay you a certain amount of money a month, then that is a much better way of doing business than it is relying on them to have to, pay you a couple of £100 every couple of years or whatever it may be. And I guess that they saw the direction of travel, and that historically they relied on almost like their kind of somewhat overlapping monopolies. So Office meant that everyone stayed on Windows, and Windows meant that everyone stayed on Office. And then they could go and kind of use that to make sure, do things with Internet Explorer, do things with Xbox, do things with DirectX to kind of reinforce those. But then nowadays it seems it's more, they've realized that effectively they missed the boat with mobile, and they don't want to miss the same boat with services, with the way Amazon, for example, like AWS is a massive business by itself, Google Cloud is a massive business by itself, and Azure, like Microsoft's kind of equivalent, are similarly like massively ramping up. And the money, the places where in Microsoft the money seems to be growing, again, I have no internal knowledge of this, it's just external. The places where money seems to be being spent by individuals on Microsoft products with the most growth are things around services and cloud computing and things like that. And that stuff, actually, open source on that stuff is a competitive advantage rather than a disadvantage. Because if you try and say, hey, we're the world's best cloud computing provider, but you can't run Linux and you can't run WordPress or whatever it may be, then that's not a smart move. So that's my take at least, but I have no idea whether I'm right or not.
Cool. Any other questions?
So the company I work for is owned by a parent company, and for quite a long time we were not allowed to use open source on the basis that we wouldn't be indemnified if somebody tried to sue us about a patent that was covered by the open source, because they were big on trying to do deals with their competitors in terms of patents. And the only reason that changed was they acquired some other companies who went, well, all our stuff's built on open source, and they went, oh, okay, then it's fine. But have you ever heard any like good arguments or ways to get around that? Are there companies you can buy indemnity insurance, or how does that work?
I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea. But I guess it's, as you say, the way I've personally found to get around stuff like that is if you're in a small organization and they say, we can't possibly do X, if you can point to much bigger, more successful organizations, or even better, competitors in the same space who are doing X and seem to have no problem with it, then that can sometimes be a more, like almost like tackling the issues side on rather than directly. But I feel like with open source particularly, nowadays, I can't imagine there being really any organizations where they would say prohibit the use of open source software entirely, because it's not feasible. Now, you can't, I would go as far as to say you literally can't, because almost all the proprietary software you use is built on top of open source software as well. So it's nigh on impossible to completely avoid it unless you build your computer from scratch in a cave or something, I don't know. Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I'll hang around for a little bit and I can go and, like, if you have a question you want to ask me individually, then we can do that way. But thank you very much for having me.
Cool.
And
thanks, Mike. Thank you everyone for coming to TechMeetUp. What we're going to do is maybe stick around for 10 more minutes if you want to chat amongst yourselves. Otherwise, we're going to go to, God, I forgot, Blue Blazer, which is at the end of the road on the left. So if you want to come to the pub, I don't know if Mike's hanging around for a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. If you want to ask Mike any questions that you didn't want live streamed, you can do it there. So yeah, thank you very much. And hopefully see you next month. Thank you.